Thank you so much. I am honored and delighted to kick off what I am sure will be an exciting and dynamic 3 days of learning and growth and fellowship. As Sharon Lynn stated, I've been at FCCIP for 3 years now, and prior to that, I was the adoption and guardianship supervisor at a local department of social service and spent nearly 15 years doing direct service in child welfare. The local department that I worked for has among the highest rates of exits to aging out in the state of Maryland. And I grew tired of trying to affect change one child, one family at a time, and I wanted to help affect change on a larger scale. In Maryland, a youth's likelihood of exiting to permanence decreases drastically once a case has been open for 2 years. These cases frustrated and saddened me all at the same time. Why was the life-changing intervention of a family a privilege for only a few and not the right of all youth in care? From my perspective, there seemed to be no urgency to close cases. We were content to maintain the status quo from one hearing to the next. There were too many cases like this, too many cases like a youth I'll call Levi. Levi entered care at the age of 3 and aged out at 21. Would be hard-pressed to say that his case closed successfully. I get it. I've done this work. These cases are hard. They're multiple crises. You're jumping from one fire to the next. Stability becomes the focus from one hearing to the next, and suddenly you find yourself 17 to 18 years later. Too many youth like Levi are aging out of care without the supports needed to help them realize their full potential, without the human supports needed to help them realize their full potential. I think it's our responsibility in child welfare to think beyond the crises and to shift our focus from the short term to the long term and appreciate how the decisions that we make today will impact youth 1 year, 5 year, and even 10 years from now. We need to reframe our view of foster care. I'm quite certain that none of us would want anyone we know or love and care about to spend even 1 minute in the system. So why is it okay for the youth that we work with to spend years and years in this system? The reality is that no matter how hard we work, not all of these cases will end in legal permanence. We need to expand our definition of success to include relational permanence. I'm sure we can all identify adults and mentors who were essential in launching us into successful adulthood. Our youth need these same supports. For little things like where you can go to do your laundry for free, to whose table you'll sit at holidays, to celebrating your successes and becoming a shoulder to lean on when you struggle. I consider it my professional passion to help youth achieve permanency. And our primary goal at the Court Improvement Program is to remove and identify and remove barriers that hinder permanence. So to give you a little bit of background about Maryland, it was a conundrum for me. Shout out to my nephew Lincoln. Conundrum is his most favorite word. On paper, Maryland child welfare seems to be doing all the right things. We have best practices implemented. We have a number of jurisdictions that are model courts. So the question is, why have we continued to struggle with our permanency outcomes for over 10 years? In 2019, Maryland completed its Child and Family Services Review, and we didn't do so hot on the permanency outcomes. And as a result of that, we are now under a Performance Improvement Plan, or PIP. Additionally, Maryland has issues with disproportionality. Black youth are twice as likely to age out of foster care compared to their white peers, who are more likely to exit to permanence. We've spent nearly 2 years since our PIP was implemented in a variety of work groups and ad hoc meetings trying to figure out the why. Why does Maryland struggle with permanency outcomes? And what we've determined is that the current data we've collected simply doesn't give us the information that we need. As I mentioned, Maryland had its CFSR review, and we were not in substantial conformity. That's a bureaucratic way of saying we failed, and we have some improvement. Prior to the PIP implementation, Maryland was the pilot for a Children's Bureau program on-site PIP planning meeting where multidisciplinary stakeholders from all across the state spent 5 intensive days gathered to discuss how Maryland could improve its permanency outcomes and the child welfare system as a whole. In the months and years since, we've spent considerable amount of time addressing two specific items on the CFSR review. The first is Permanency Item 5, which is establishing the permanency goal for the child. As you can see, Maryland was trending in the wrong direction, or as my nephew would say, we were doing worser. And it's important to point out that the bulk of this data is pre-COVID, so we can't even blame the COVID pandemic for our poor numbers. As you can see in the most recent quarter, we've returned back to where we started, which was not at a very good point to begin with, and we have some work to do. The second item, achieving that permanency goal, Maryland is doing less bad, but as you can see, we still have room for improvement. I challenge all of us and those that I work with to look at the data differently. These are not just widgets. These are actual human lives that we're responsible for. A child is removed from the system because of an issue, and a child is removed from their family of origin because of an issue in the home. And we in the system say, we can help, we can fix things, we can make it better. But the reality is, far too many youth are worse off after being in foster care. Maryland struggles with permanency outcomes 5 and 6, which I highlighted previously. We also struggle with permanency items 8 and 11, which pertain to visits with family and relationships with parents. So put another way, 65% of youth in Maryland's child welfare system don't achieve permanency. 68% age out without permanency. 42% do not have consistent contact with family, and 44% lose their connection to a parent while in care. Needless to say, we have a lot of room for improvement. And what we've been doing simply isn't working. Why all the fuss about permanency? Why does it matter? Well, the research is pretty clear. Youth who emancipate are much more likely to be involved with the criminal justice system, less likely to graduate from high school, more likely to have housing instability, and are more likely to have crisis pregnancies, which then lead to their children being placed in foster care, thus continuing the generational cycle. And again, African American youth are much more likely to age out than their white or Latino peers, which thus contributes to disproportionality in other social systems. We do our youth a disservice by not trying to achieve permanency. Stability is valued over permanency to the child's detriment. We focus on independent living and transitional planning for teenage youth, on services instead of connections and family-based relationships. We know that resilience research tells us that in order to thrive after trauma, the greatest intervention is that of a stable relationship with a caring adult. So we have to ask ourselves, when no one is getting paid, who will be there for that youth? I wanted my ARP to address permanency, specifically, how do courts help or hinder that process, and to obtain qualitative data to help better Maryland's permanency outcomes. My action research project, My PICO, that I lovingly crafted, if Maryland Child Welfare, CINA judges, Child in Need of Assistance, that's what they're called in Maryland, if Maryland Child Welfare judges and magistrates receive additional information about evidence-informed or evidence-based practices, such as concurrent planning, through training and resources or tools, such as an infographic or fact sheet, and then implement those evidence-informed, evidence-based practices, will that have a positive effect on permanency outcomes for youth in Maryland child welfare? I'll talk a little bit about my process. First, I conducted a review of available literature as well as information from the PIP implementation meeting that was held in spring 2019. I then presented my proposed project to our FCCIP subcommittee. I recruited judges and attorneys to volunteer for focus groups and interviews. And I think it's worth noting that the judges and attorneys were very eager to volunteer. They were eager to have this discussion, to participate in discussions around permanency in Maryland. I developed the focus group and interview protocols. Due to schedules, there were only 2 focus groups and the majority were changed to individual interviews. I conducted 2 focus groups and 8 individual interviews, and then presented a training to judges and magistrates, and then asked for evaluations of that training through a feedback survey. Some of the highlights from the research in terms of systemic barriers to permanency on a national level. Continuance, postponements, resets, whatever they're called in your respective jurisdiction, they contribute substantially to delays in achieving permanence. Applying Adoption and Safe Families Act, or ASFA, to real life. This is particularly a challenge for families where substance use disorder is a concern. One of the major highlights was the issue of staff turnover and what happens when staff leave. You have a loss of history, a loss of momentum in the case. I feel like you have to start over. Insufficient resources, whether that's services for families, representation for parents or children, and then cultural barriers. We see that oftentimes many perceive that the benefits of remaining in care are better than establishing relationships. We have situations where workers encourage youth not to remain in care rather than be adopted or have their case closed to guardianship so that they can receive the perceived financial benefits of remaining in care. Some of the Maryland-specific barriers touched on: placement stability valued over permanence, youth encouraged to stay in care to receive benefits, and one worth noting, the age of consent in Maryland is 10, and I believe this is the youngest in the nation. So a youth who is 10 years of age or older must consent to being adopted. And what we find is that oftentimes a youth will say no when they are first asked, and then that discussion is never had again. There's no unpacking of the no. We have inadequate and inconsistent family find efforts in jurisdictions where there are boots on the ground. Folks are going out and knocking on doors versus only sending letters or making phone calls. We find that they're much more effective in reaching relatives, particularly paternal relatives. And the last one I want to touch on is the two-sided accountability, the courts and the department. Now, I will confess, when I worked on the other side, I was guilty of blaming the court when things were not working well and when there were delays and hurdles. But now that I've been on the policy side for over 3 years now, I understand that the system is much more nuanced than I had originally thought, and that court and legal, though they are often conflated, are not the same thing. Each has distinct roles and responsibilities. Another highlight from the research was the importance of the role of judges in dependency cases. The role of the judge in child welfare matters is unique compared to all other matters. It's not a traditional role like you would have in a criminal or a family law case, for example. Judges represent the highest point of authority in the child's life in that case. Some of the key points are that judges are often the only consistent presence in a case due to staff turnover. So they have historical case knowledge. They become the champion of the family. If you're following the one judge, one family model, the judge is there from the beginning and has seen where the family started from and is able to champion the progress that they've made. They also represent a positive professional role model for the youth. What the literature review didn't include was the perspective of judges. I found that there was a lot of correlational research, but not a lot of causal research. Most of the research pertaining to barriers on permanence is from the perspective of the Child Welfare Agency and rarely included the judge's perspective. As I said, to elicit this perspective, focus groups and interviews were conducted. So a little bit of information about the focus groups and interviews conducted with judges and attorneys. We had a wide variety of diversity in terms of location. Small, rural, urban, and medium-sized jurisdictions were represented. There was diversity in terms of years of experience and gender, and the participants were evenly split among those who identify as Black and white. They were all asked questions regarding permanency and regarding their relationships with stakeholders. Some of the themes from the focus groups and interviews with judges. They highlighted the lack of resources, whether that's money, qualified workers, attorneys, services. They also shared that they rarely make a finding of no reasonable efforts. Many shared that they were afraid of the unintended consequence of making the finding for fear of costing the department money. As one judge said, "It's been hammered into us not to do it because it'll cost the department money." They also shared that they have no choice but to make a finding of no reasonable efforts if nothing has been done in the court order. So you see the bar is set very low. And lastly, they wanted to acknowledge parents' progress if they just had a little more time. It was very clear that judges empathize with parents' situations and the dearth of resources that are available to support them. Additionally, the judges shared that they are rarely asked by child or parent counsel to make a no reasonable efforts finding. All of this was very intriguing, and I wanted to hear what the legal community had to say. Surprisingly, they agreed with judges and magistrates. Very rare that all parties are in agreement, but on this issue, there was consistency of response. Additionally, the attorneys shared that it's not routine for the case plans to be attached to court reports, that concurrent planning is not common, and they agreed that they rarely ask the judge to make a no reasonable efforts finding. One of the comments, why bother? It's not going to happen. So as I was sitting around consulting with my coworkers and reviewing all of the information that we had gathered from the interviews and focus groups, it really stood out to us the consistency in responses, regardless of role, jurisdiction, or geographic location, and that the bar for no reasonable efforts was extra low. All of the judges commented that if nothing has been done in the court order or close to nothing, then we have no choice but to make a finding of no reasonable efforts. Additionally, the parties are aware of the laws which state that the department must provide a written case plan for each child in foster care and that the case plan shall include concurrent permanency plans. However, this is an area where practice is much different than policy. Case plans are not routinely included with court reports, and concurrent planning is rare across the state. Additionally, it became very apparent that judges are not using their most powerful tool. The feds gave judges this power of reasonable efforts findings to hold all of the parties accountable, and the finding was not to be used as a rubber stamp. To have that oversight role and to keep everything moving smoothly. Judges are sensitive to the difficult situation parents are in. They recognize that the department is trying to do more with less for increasingly complex cases. I realized that my task with my project was to help judges rethink how to use their most powerful tool, to clarify that a no reasonable efforts finding is not an immediate death knell. There isn't an immediate fiscal penalty. The department has the opportunity to cure the finding after a no reasonable efforts finding is made. That judges needed to think about a no reasonable efforts finding as a time-limited response to an unmet need that can be used to benefit children and families. And so I shared with the judges that I had spoken with several department directors who informed of the process, what happens once a no reasonable efforts finding is made. And indeed, they do have an opportunity to cure that finding at the next hearing, and the Children's Bureau often knows nothing about the initial no reasonable efforts finding. So with all of that information and data that I had gathered, I created a training titled Reframing Outcomes, Taking New Inventory of Judicial Permanency Tools. The training was a 90-minute virtual training held via Zoom at the end of July for child welfare judges and magistrates. There were 13 persons in attendance, which included judges, magistrates, attorneys, and other legal staff. Topics covered included the one judge, one family model, time-certain calendaring, which is preferred over the cattle call model, courtroom management, and the importance of judges setting the expectations regarding continuance policy, whether hearings start on time, whether attorneys consult with their clients prior to the hearing, and holding the department accountable. Additionally, we reviewed Maryland timeliness measures regarding whether hearings had been held within the mandated timeframes. And as I touched on initially, Maryland on paper is doing all the right things. We even have requirements above and beyond what the federal law requires. Our permanency plan reviews occur every 6 months, and the federal law requires that they occur every 12 months. But still and yet, those additional hearings are not helping to advance permanency for our youth. And lastly, participants reviewed and discussed a case scenario. Participants were asked to do a self-assessment of their knowledge and skill before and after the training on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being no knowledge or skills and 5 being a lot of knowledge or skills. Surveys were sent to all 13 attendees, and we had a 54% response rate. Cannot tell you how thrilled I was at that response rate. In our office, our response rate for trainings averages 25 to 30%. So I was blown away at how eager participants were to evaluate the training. As I mentioned before, there was a diversity in role in the dependency system among attendees, as well as years in current position. The first question they were asked was regarding their knowledge of the Maryland CFSR process. And these results are not surprising, given that most of the attendees are involved with or familiar with PIP-related activities that have been ongoing for nearly the past 2 years. The second question pertained to permanency outcomes data. And these results highlight the need for the system as a whole to share the data with a wider group of stakeholders. Data collection is futile if we don't use it in a meaningful way. The next question pertained to disproportionality. Maryland, like most states across the nation, has issues with disproportionality. However, as of yet, there are no statewide initiatives to address this issue. Participants were asked about case planning and concurrent permanency planning knowledge before and after the training. Maryland law requires this and it's best practice. However, it was clear from the focus groups and interviews that this process is not being done consistently across the state. Definitely an area for Maryland to improve. Outcomes associated with aging out of foster care. To me, these results highlight the impact of not achieving permanency, and for judges understanding the cumulative effect of their decision makings from one hearing to the next. On the question of relational permanence, you can see there was a significant increase in knowledge after the training. We need to talk more about this as a system and be intentional in our efforts, because children are removed from their families of origins, and in that process, relationships are destroyed, and we've been focused on services instead of people. And we know that not all cases will end with legal permanence, and so it's very important that we make sure that youth are connected with caring adults who will be consistent presence in their lives once they're no longer in care. Was blown away by the responses to this question, the understanding of how internal or court practices contribute to permanency delays. And to me, this highlights that judges have a greater awareness of their role and the impact that it has on cases, and that they're more than just an impartial arbitrator of facts, that they do play a significant role in this process and in the life of a case. External barriers to permanence. Again, recognition that the system as a whole isn't working and we must do better. And lastly, how no reasonable efforts findings can be cured. It seems that I corrected the big myth about the money being taken away immediately from the department when a no reasonable efforts finding is made, that there isn't an immediate fiscal penalty. And hopefully with this knowledge now, judges will begin to use their tool in a more effective way. So next steps, where do we begin? Well, first, our office is in the process of updating the best practices manual, which will include information on concurrent planning. Second, judges are receiving the message that them making an inquiry about department policy or practice and services is not the same as judges performing social work. One of the judges in the focus groups shared that he now inquires about case plans at adjudication and disposition hearings. And initially, the department came and looked like a deer in headlights. But now they know that the judge expects those documents, and so they come prepared to the hearings with those documents in hand and are able to engage in a more meaningful discussion regarding permanency at a much earlier point in the case than previous. As one of the attorneys in that jurisdiction said, we, the department, have to rise to the level of expectations. It's important that judges set the tone and create the standards and expectations. Again, in most cases, you get what you expect. The bar should be higher than doing nothing in order to receive a no reasonable efforts findings. Our families and youth deserve that. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the impact that this fellowship year has had on me professionally and personally. I am not a statistician. I did not go into social work because I like math. In fact, I've joked that I have spreadsheetophobia. However, after this past year, I am much more comfortable in using data and letting it tell the story. Quite often in social services, decisions are made based on emotion, and we need to get away from that in order to be more effective in our interventions and to do things that really make a difference for families. I am empowered to use my voice and confident that I deserve a seat at the table. I mean, let's be honest, working with judges can be very intimidating, but I've now recognized and appreciate my level of knowledge and expertise and recognize that I do have something to contribute to the conversation. Lastly, the increased network of peers and new friends and resources has been invaluable, both professionally and personally. And I know that they will serve, those new relationships will serve me well in the months and years to follow. Lastly, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Arlene and Sharon Lynn for their amazing support, encouragement, guidance. I was on the struggle bus a couple times during this fellowship year, and they were very supportive and nurturing and were committed to helping make sure that I finished my project successfully. Also want to give a huge shout out to my amazing mentor and direct supervisor, Hope Gary, and my coworker, Abby Hill. I could not have done this project without you, and I appreciate you more than words can say.